August 17, 1943, saw two columns of dust rising above the parched roads of Sicily as George Patton and Bernard Montgomery raced toward the prize of Messina. It was not just a battle against the retreating German rear guards, but a visceral clash of titanic egos that would define the Allied high command throughout the war. One man sought redemption for American failure, while the other demanded total subservience to his perceived military genius. To understand the deep-seated animosity that threatened to fracture the Western Alliance, we must look back to the sweltering heat of the North African desert, where the reputations of these two titans were forged in vastly different fires. By the summer of 1943, Bernard Montgomery was not merely a general, but a living legend who had salvaged British pride at El Alamein after 3 years of humiliating retreats across Europe and Asia. He was the hero who had finally outmaneuvered the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, and he carried himself with a theatrical arrogance that suggested he alone possessed the secret to modern mechanized warfare. Montgomery wore a distinctive black beret with 2 cap badges and cultivated a meticulous image of a military savior who was absolutely certain of his own infallibility. While Montgomery was basking in the adoration of the British press, George Patton was a man possessed by a desperate need to prove that the American soldier was second to none. The American entry into the ground war had begun with the catastrophic embarrassment at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where inexperienced troops were routed by veteran German panzers, resulting in thousands of casualties. Patton was the man brought in to fix the disaster, and he did so with a brutal discipline that transformed the slovenly Second Corps into a professional fighting force within a matter of weeks. Despite this spectacular achievement, Patton felt himself cast as a supporting actor in a theater where Montgomery was the undisputed star, and he watched with growing resentment as the British press ignored American contributions. The planning for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, served as the catalyst that turned professional rivalry into a personal vendetta that would haunt the Allied effort until the fall of Berlin. The original strategic plan envisioned a balanced assault where Patton's 7th Army and Montgomery's 8th Army would drive towards shared objectives with equal opportunities for glory. However, Montgomery viewed the Americans as junior partners who lacked the seasoning for a primary role, and he used his political leverage to demand a total revision of the invasion strategy. He appealed directly to Dwight D. Eisenhower, insisting that his 8th Army should have the main thrust toward Messina, while the Americans were relegated to the humiliating task of merely protecting his flank. Eisenhower was a man caught between the strategic necessity of military efficiency and the political reality of maintaining a fragile alliance, so he ultimately gave Montgomery exactly what he wanted. Patton was furious at being reduced to a subservient role, and he privately told his staff that Montgomery had essentially stolen the campaign before the first soldier had even stepped into the Sicilian beaches. This decision created a toxic environment where the two commanders were no longer fighting a common enemy, but were instead locked in a bitter struggle for prestige and historical legacy. The invasion of Sicily began on July 10, 1943, and almost immediately Montgomery's carefully orchestrated plan began to unravel under the weight of fierce German resistance. The British 8th Army found itself bogged down in a bloody stalemate near Catania, where the rugged terrain and fortified coastal roads played directly into the hands of the German defenders. Montgomery blamed everyone except his own rigid planning, and he accused the Americans of failing to draw enough German forces away from his front while his own troops bled in the shadow of Mount Etna. Patton saw his opportunity to break the shackles of his secondary role, and he went to General Harold Alexander with a bold proposal to drive his army across the island to capture Palermo. Although this move was not part of the original plan, Alexander realized that the stalemate needed to be broken, and he granted Patton the freedom to unleash his armored divisions. What followed was one of the most spectacular displays of mobile warfare in the entire conflict, as Patton's forces covered over 100 miles of mountainous terrain in a mere 72 hours. The capture of Palermo on July 22, 1943, turned Patton into a global sensation, and the headlines that once belonged exclusively to Montgomery were now screaming the name of the American general. Patton had deliberately stolen the spotlight, and Montgomery was deeply humiliated by the realization that he had been shown up by the man he had dismissed as a mere flame guard. The race for Messina was now truly on, as both commanders pushed their exhausted men beyond the limits of human endurance to reach the symbolic trophy of the campaign. Patton drove his 3rd Infantry Division relentlessly through the night, fighting off both the heat and scattered German rear guards, while Montgomery launched desperate amphibious operations to bypass the bottlenecks on the eastern coast. The rivalry had become so personal that operational decisions were being made based on ego rather than military necessity, as neither man could stand the thought of arriving second. On the morning of August 17th, the vanguard of Patton's army entered the outskirts of Messina just hours before the British patrols arrived. Patton staged a theatrical welcome for the arriving British officers, rubbing their victory in their faces with an exaggerated courtesy that was designed to be as insulting as possible. Montgomery was so stung by the defeat that he refused to appear in person and sent his subordinates to witness the American flags already flying over the city that he had claimed as his own. While Patton had won the race, he had also sowed the seeds of his own temporary downfall through his volatile temperament and lack of restraint during the heat of battle. During the final days of the Sicilian campaign, Patton committed two catastrophic mistakes that would give his detractors the ammunition they needed to sideline him. In two separate incidents in field hospitals, Patton slapped soldiers who were suffering from combat fatigue, accusing them of cowardice and threatening them with physical violence. When these incidents became public knowledge, the outcry was immediate and severe, with politicians and the press demanding Patton's immediate dismissal and court-martial. Eisenhower was caught in a political firestorm, and although he valued Patton's tactical genius, he was forced to demand a series of public apologies that deeply wounded Patton's pride. Montgomery watched the scandal unfold with a sense of vindicated satisfaction, and he told anyone who would listen that Patton was an undisciplined and reckless commander who was unsuited for high-level leadership. These slapping incidents provided Eisenhower with the perfect excuse to sideline Patton when the planning for the greatest invasion in history, Operation Overlord, began in earnest. As the Allied High Command gathered in England to prepare for the invasion of France, the power dynamic shifted heavily in favor of the methodical Montgomery. Because of his perceived stability and his status as a British hero, Montgomery was named as the overall ground commander for the D-Day invasion. Patton was left in a state of professional purgatory and was assigned to lead a fictional unit known as the 1st United States Army Group, which was a massive deception operation designed to trick the Germans. The man who had outpaced Montgomery in Sicily was now being used as a decoy, while his rival was given command of every American, British, and Canadian soldier who would storm the beaches of Normandy. The humiliation for Patton was total as he watched from the sidelines, while Montgomery dictated the strategy for the liberation of Europe. Montgomery's performance in Normandy, however, would soon reignite the controversy regarding his cautious and slow-moving style of warfare. He had famously promised to capture the city of Caen on D-Day itself, but the reality on the ground was a month-long grinding stalemate that resulted in immense casualties for the British and Canadian forces. Montgomery's inability to achieve a breakout led to growing frustration within the American ranks and even within the British government as the liberation of France seemed to be stalling. Just as he had done in Sicily, Montgomery refused to admit any flaws in his planning and instead blamed the weather, the terrain, and even the lack of aggression from American units. Patton was languishing in England, watching his colleagues struggle, and he wrote in his diary that he could have finished the campaign in half the time if he had been given the chance. The tension between the two styles of command, Montgomery's methodical preparation versus Patton's aggressive mobility, was reaching a breaking point as the summer of 1944 progressed. The world was about to see what would happen when Patton was finally unleashed from his cage to exploit the opening that Montgomery's stalemate had nearly closed. On August 1st, 1944, Patton's Third Army finally became operational in France, and the dynamic of the war changed almost overnight. While Montgomery was still focused on the static battle lines around Caen, Patton launched his armored columns into the open plains of France with a speed that left German high command in a state of total confusion. Patton's tanks were covering 30 to 50 miles a day, liberating towns and capturing thousands of prisoners before the Germans even realized the front line had moved. The contrast between Patton's rapid advance and Montgomery's slow progress was impossible for the press to ignore, and the rivalry was reignited with a new and dangerous intensity. Montgomery viewed Patton's success as a direct threat to his own authority, and he began to complain to Eisenhower that the Americans were receiving an unfair share of supplies and fuel. He argued that Patton's recklessness was leading the Allied armies into a potential trap, and he demanded that all resources be concentrated for a single thrust into Germany under his own command. This disagreement over strategy, the broad front versus the narrow thrust, would become the defining argument of the final year of the war. Patton believed that a broad front would keep the Germans off balance, while Montgomery wanted the glory of leading the final charge into Berlin himself. The strategic friction between Patton and Montgomery reached a fever pitch as the Allied armies approached the borders of Germany, where the debate over how to deliver the final blow turned into a bitter struggle for dwindling resources and historical prestige. Montgomery proposed a radical departure from the existing strategy, demanding that Eisenhower concentrate all available Allied resources into a single, massive, and concentrated thrust into northern Germany under his personal command. He claimed that this pencil-like thrust would allow him to drive straight to Berlin and end the war by Christmas, provided that Patton's Third Army was essentially halted and stripped of its supplies to support the British advance. Patton was absolutely livid at the suggestion, arguing instead for a broad front strategy where multiple axes of advance would keep the German defenders from concentrating their remaining strength in any one sector. He believed that his Third Army could break through the German defenses and reach the Rhine long before Montgomery even finished his meticulous preparations. Eisenhower, ever the diplomat, attempted to find a middle ground by approving a broad front approach, but ultimately sided with Montgomery for a specific, high-stakes airborne gamble known as Operation Market Garden. This decision meant that vital fuel, ammunition, and transport resources were diverted away from Patton's surging tanks and redirected to Montgomery's ambitious plan to drop 3 airborne divisions behind German lines in the Netherlands. Patton felt that Eisenhower was rewarding Montgomery's previous failures and methodical slowness while punishing the very success and momentum that the Third Army had fought so hard to achieve across France. On September 17, 1944, the largest airborne assault in human history began as thousands of paratroopers descended upon the Dutch towns of Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem to seize key bridges. The plan relied on the British ground forces racing up a single, narrow highway to link up with the paratroopers. But the operation quickly descended into a strategic disaster. German resistance proved to be far more formidable than British intelligence had predicted, and the single road became a literal shooting gallery for German anti-tank crews. At the bridge too far in Arnhem, British paratroopers held out heroically for 9 days against overwhelming odds, but the relief columns never arrived, leading to the deaths or capture of over 8,000 men. Despite the clear failure to achieve the primary strategic objectives, Montgomery stubbornly declared Market Garden to be 90% successful, a claim that almost no one else in the Allied High Command accepted. Patton, who had been forced to halt his own advance because his tanks had literally run dry of fuel, felt completely vindicated in his warnings that Montgomery's plan was a reckless gamble. The failure of Market Garden meant the war would not end in 1944, and the Allied armies were forced to settle into a grueling winter campaign along the German border. The tension was momentarily pushed aside on December 16, 1944, when the Germans launched their last great offensive through the Ardennes forest, catching the Allied forces in a state of total surprise. Within days, German panzer divisions had punched a massive hole in the Allied lines, creating the famous Bulge and threatening to split the British and American armies apart. Eisenhower was forced to make a desperate command decision, giving Montgomery temporary control over all American forces north of the breakthrough, while ordering Patton to perform a nearly impossible maneuver from the south. Patton was told to wheel his entire Third Army 90 degrees and counterattack the German flank in the middle of a brutal winter storm. What Patton achieved in the following hours became a legend in military history, as he moved 3 full divisions across over 100 miles of icy, clogged roads in just 48 hours. This logistical and tactical feat allowed the Americans to relieve the besieged paratroopers at Bastogne and began the process of rolling up the German advance. While Patton was executing this masterstroke, Montgomery remained extremely cautious in the north, focusing on reorganizing his lines rather than launching an immediate counterattack. The rivalry turned toxic once again on January 7, 1945, when Montgomery held a press conference to discuss the Battle of the Bulge. Instead of praising the bravery of the American soldiers who had held the line at Bastogne or Patton's incredible march, Montgomery implied that his own leadership had saved the Americans from their own incompetence. He talked about bringing order to chaos and essentially portrayed the British Army as the savior of a reeling and disorganized American force. This presentation of events nearly destroyed the Allied alliance, causing the American press to erupt in fury and leading General Omar Bradley to threaten his resignation if Montgomery was ever given command of American troops again. Eisenhower had to intervene personally to prevent a total fracture, as Montgomery had effectively stolen credit for what was arguably the greatest American victory of the war. As the Allies prepared for the final crossing of the Rhine River, the competition between Patton and Montgomery reached its final absurd conclusion. Eisenhower had designated Montgomery's 21st Army Group to make the primary crossing, and Montgomery spent weeks accumulating a massive force with overwhelming artillery and airborne support. However, on March 7th, American forces unexpectedly captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen while it was still standing, giving the Americans the first foothold across the river. Not to be outdone, Patton launched a hasty and daring assault across the Rhine on the night of March 22nd, catching the Germans completely off guard. Patton called Bradley and explicitly asked him to keep the crossing a secret for a day so that he could get more troops across before Montgomery's massive, choreographed operation even began. When Montgomery finally launched his operation on March 23rd, complete with massive naval support and airborne drops, he discovered that Patton had already been across the river for 24 hours. The international press couldn't help but point out the irony that Montgomery needed an entire army group and weeks of preparation to do what Patton had achieved on the fly with minimal resources. This final act of one-upmanship served as the perfect bookend to a rivalry that had started on the dusty roads of Sicily and ended in the heart of the German Reich. The feud was never merely a matter of personal dislike, but a fundamental clash between two different philosophies and two vastly different national egos. The consequences of this rivalry were often measured in the lives of the soldiers who served under them, as resources were sometimes divided to satisfy egos rather than strategic necessity. Eisenhower was forced to spend a significant portion of his time managing these two titans instead of focusing purely on the destruction of the German military. Patton's life came to a tragic and premature end on December 21, 1945, following a car accident in Germany, leaving him unable to ever write his memoirs or formally defend his record. Montgomery, on the other hand, lived until 1976 and spent decades carefully crafting his own legacy through memoirs and interviews where he often minimized Patton's contributions. He famously wrote that Patton was good for pursuit, but not much else, while Patton's private diaries revealed he viewed Montgomery as a tired little man. History has ultimately delivered a nuanced verdict on both men, recognizing Montgomery as a capable, if overly cautious, commander who provided the British people with a much-needed hero. Yet the legend of George Patton continues to grow, as he is remembered for achieving more with fewer resources and for being right about strategy more often than his British rival. Patton fought not only the German Wehrmacht, but also a political and personal battle against a rival who held more influence and support throughout the conflict. The race to Messina, the stalemate in Normandy, the gamble of Market Garden, and the miracle of the Bulge all stand as testaments to this incredible rivalry. In the end, the general who died young and never got to tell his own story has become the more enduring legend in the annals of military history. The psychological toll of this rivalry extended deep into the staff levels of both armies, creating a culture of suspicion that sometimes hindered intelligence sharing and joint planning. Patton's staff often felt that the British were withholding information to ensure Montgomery's success, while Montgomery's officers viewed the Americans as amateurish cowboys who were lucky rather than skilled. This lack of trust was most evident during the breakout from Normandy, where a more coordinated effort might have trapped and destroyed the entire German 7th Army at the Falaise Pocket. Instead, the delay caused by arguments over boundaries and responsibilities allowed thousands of veteran German troops to escape and fight again. Patton's aggressive spirit was often his greatest strength and his greatest liability, as it drove him to push his men to the brink of exhaustion, but also led to the public relations disasters that nearly ended his career. He truly believed he was a man of destiny, a reincarnated warrior who had fought in every great conflict in human history, from the legions of Rome to the cavalry of Napoleon. This mystical belief in his own purpose gave him the courage to take risks that other generals found terrifying, but it also made him incredibly difficult to manage for a superior like Eisenhower. Montgomery, by contrast, was a man of cold logic in meticulous detail who believed that war could be solved like a mathematical equation if one only had enough preparation and material. The special relationship between the United States and Great Britain was tested to its absolute limit by these two men, as they represented the competing interests of a declining empire and a rising superpower. Montgomery was fighting to maintain Britain's prestige on the world stage, while Patton was fighting to prove that the American industrial and military machine was now the dominant force in the West. Their rivalry was a microcosm of the larger geopolitical shifts occurring as the old world gave way to the new. Even in the final days of the war, as they raced toward the Elbe River, the competition remained fierce, with each man trying to liberate as much territory as possible to secure their place in the history books. The logistical miracle of Patton's Third Army, which traveled further and faster than any other army in history, was a direct result of his blood and guts philosophy. He demanded that his officers lead from the front and that his soldiers maintain a professional appearance even in the heat of combat. He famously insisted on tonner neckties in the jungle and polished helmets, believing that discipline in small things led to discipline in the face of death. Montgomery's discipline was of a different sort, based on the absolute confidence his men had in his ability to not waste their lives in poorly planned attacks. While Patton was feared, Montgomery was respected by his desert rats, who believed that Monty would always provide them with the tools they needed to win. The ultimate irony of their rivalry is that both men were essential to the Allied victory. Without Montgomery's steady hand in the early years and his ability to organize massive amphibious operations, the Allies might never have returned to the continent. Conversely, without Patton's relentless drive and operational brilliance, the war in Europe might have dragged on into 1946, causing countless more casualties and allowing the Soviet Union to occupy even more of Western Europe. They were two halves of a necessary whole, even if they could never see the value in each other. Their mutual hatred acted as a strange kind of catalyst, pushing each man to perform at his absolute peak to avoid being outshined by the other. Today, as we look back on the fields of Sicily and the forests of the Ardennes, the names Patton and Montgomery remain inseparable from the history of World War II. Their feud has become the stuff of military folklore, studied in war colleges around the world, as a lesson in the importance of command temperament and the complexities of coalition warfare. While the statues and monuments stand in their honor, the true legacy of their rivalry is the hard-won peace they helped to secure. The two columns of dust that rose in Sicily eventually settled, but the echoes of their clash still resonate through history, reminding us that even the greatest of events are driven by the very human passions of those in command. In your opinion, was Patton's aggressive blood and guts style more effective for winning the war? Or was Montgomery's cautious, methodical approach necessary to ensure the Allies didn't suffer a catastrophic defeat? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.